Part 1: The Discovery. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey. It sits on a limestone ridge above the Harran Plain, in a region the ancient Greeks called Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and which today forms part of the border zone between modern Turkey and Syria. The hill is not large. From a distance it looks unremarkable, a low, rounded rise in a landscape of dry grass and scattered stone, the kind of hill that travelers have been passing without a second glance for 10,000 years. But beneath it, packed into the earth, sealed under centuries of deliberate fill, there are rings. Massive rings of T-shaped limestone pillars, each one carved from a single block of stone, each one standing up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars are decorated, with animals carved in high relief, with abstract symbols, with human arms and hands. They face each other across circular enclosures that were built, used, and then carefully, intentionally buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, but filled in, covered over, preserved under the earth as if someone wanted them to last forever. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means pot-belly hill. It is the oldest temple complex ever discovered. Its oldest layers were built approximately 11,600 years ago, more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 7,000 years before the pyramids of Giza, in an era that archaeologists had always assumed was far too early for any kind of monumental construction, any kind of organized religion, any kind of civilization as we understand the word. Everything we thought we knew about the origins of human society rested on a sequence: first farming, then villages, then cities, then temples, then civilization. Göbekli Tepe was built before farming, before villages, before pottery, before writing, before the wheel. The sequence was wrong. Tonight, I want to take you to that hill. I want to walk you through the excavations, through the enclosures, through the carved limestone and the bones and the thousands of years of silence. I want to tell you about the people who built it, the archaeologist who devoted his life to understanding it, and the question that Göbekli Tepe most insistently asks, a question that, even now, no one can fully answer. Who were these people? And what were they doing here? Let's begin. To understand Göbekli Tepe, you need to understand where it sits, not just geographically, but in time. 11,600 years ago, the world was emerging from the last ice age. The great glacier that had covered much of the northern hemisphere were retreating. Sea levels were rising. Forests were spreading northward across what had been frozen tundra. And in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land sweeping from the eastern Mediterranean through what is now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, the climate was becoming warmer and wetter, transforming a cold, dry steppe into a landscape of grasses and woodlands and seasonal rivers. This was the world that the builders of Göbekli Tepe inhabited. Not the world of cities and states and writing that we think of when we say civilization. A world of hunter-gatherers, people who lived by tracking animals and harvesting wild plants, who moved with the seasons, who built shelters they could leave behind, who had no pottery, no metal tools, no domesticated crops or animals. Or so we thought. The orthodox picture of this period, the period archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, roughly 11,000 to 7,000 years before the present, was a picture of simplicity. Hunter-gatherers lived in small, mobile bands. They were too busy surviving to build anything permanent. Religion, if it existed at all in any organized form, was a matter of small figurines, cave paintings, the occasional ritual burial. The capacity for large-scale coordinated construction, for the kind of organized social effort that monumental architecture requires, was something that came later, much later, with agriculture, with surplus food, with settled communities and specialization of labor. Göbekli Tepe does not fit this picture. It shatters it. The site had been known, in a loose sense, since the 1960s. A survey team from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago had visited the hill in 1963, noted the presence of flint tools and broken limestone on the surface, and recorded it as a likely medieval cemetery. The T-shaped tops of the buried pillars, just visible above the surface, were mistaken for grave markers. The site was logged and largely forgotten. It was not until 1994 that the hill was seen by someone who understood what it might be. His name was Klaus Schmidt. He was a German archaeologist working for the German Archaeological Institute, and he had spent years excavating Neolithic sites in the region. He was, by training and temperament, exactly the right person to recognize what the hill contained. He had a deep knowledge of the period, an instinct for reading landscapes, and, crucially, an open enough mind to consider possibilities that the orthodoxy of his field had ruled out. Schmidt visited Göbekli Tepe in the fall of 1994, looking for a new site to excavate. He walked the surface of the hill, examined the flint tools scattered across it, and felt, as he later described it, an immediate sense that something large was beneath the ground. The flint tools were not the scattered debris of a passing camp. They were dense, concentrated, exactly the kind of surface scatter you would expect from sustained, intensive human activity over a long period. And the limestone fragments, the T-shapes that previous surveyors had taken for grave markers, were too large, too regular, too deliberately shaped to be natural formations. Schmidt went back to his colleagues. He secured funding. And in 1995, he began to dig. What he found, in the first season and in the years that followed, exceeded anything he or anyone else had imagined. Under a meter or two of fill, the excavators found the tops of massive limestone pillars, arranged in circles. As the excavations deepened, the pillars emerged, enormous, precisely shaped, decorated with carved animals. And the dating, when it came back from the laboratories, was not what anyone expected. 11,600 years. Give or take a century or two. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe were being built at the same moment that agriculture was just beginning, not here, but in the broader region. And the people who built these monuments, with these tools, in this era, were hunter-gatherers. Schmidt spent the rest of his life at Göbekli Tepe. He died in 2014, at the site he had given everything to understand, with most of the hill still unexcavated. Let me describe the pillars to you. They are T-shaped in cross-section, a tall rectangular shaft rising to a broad, flat capital that extends on both sides, creating the T. The shape, when you look at it for a while, begins to look like something specific, like a stylized human form, seen from the front. The top of the T is the head and shoulders. The shaft is the body. And on some of the pillars, particularly the two largest pillars in each enclosure, which stand at the center, this impression is confirmed by carved details, human arms along the sides of the shaft, hands at the front, a belt around the waist with a foxpelt loincloth hanging from it. These are figures. Not abstract monuments. Not simple standing stones. They are beings, almost certainly supernatural beings, gods or spirits or ancestral figures of some kind, represented in stone, standing in their circles, facing each other across the enclosures that were built around them. The larger pillars, the central ones, are massive. Up to 6 meters tall, up to 20 tons. The smaller pillars that line the walls of the enclosures are less imposing but still substantial, each one a deliberate, labor-intensive creation. And they are decorated, covered with carved reliefs of animals, foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, lions, aurochs, gazelles, and stranger, harder-to-identify creatures arranged in compositions that seem to follow some iconographic logic we have not yet fully recovered. The carving is accomplished. Not primitive, not tentative, but accomplished. The animals are rendered with a precision and a naturalism that speak to a long tradition of artistic skill. Someone had been making images like this for a long time before they made these. The limestone itself came from a quarry nearby, the same ridge of rock on which the site sits. The blocks were cut from the bedrock, shaped on site, and then raised and set into prepared sockets in the ground. How? With ropes and levers and human effort, presumably, but the logistics of moving 20-ton blocks without wheeled transport or draft animals represent an organizational challenge that would tax any pre-industrial society, let alone one we had previously imagined as living in small, simple bands. The excavations at Göbekli Tepe have revealed, so far, a series of roughly circular enclosures, rooms, or spaces, defined by walls of unworked stone with a large T-shaped pillars set into them at regular intervals. The enclosures that have been most fully excavated, labeled, in the prosaic notation of archaeology, enclosures A, B, C, and D, vary in size but share the same basic form. Each has two large central pillars, standing taller than the rest, facing each other across the space. Around the walls, smaller pillars are set at intervals, their T-shaped tops just below the level of what would have been the roof. The floor is smooth, carefully leveled bedrock or packed limestone plaster. Enclosure D is the largest and most elaborately decorated of the excavated enclosures. Its central pillars stand nearly 5.5 meters tall. Their carved decorations are extensive, animals, abstract symbols, and at the very top of the shaft of one pillar, what appears to be a carved scene, a headless human figure, surrounded by animals, in a composition that may represent a ritual, a myth, a cosmological image. Beyond the main excavated area, geophysical surveys, ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, have revealed that the excavated enclosures represent only a fraction of what is there. The survey suggests at least 16 further enclosures, still unexcavated, spread across a much larger area of the hilltop. There may be more still beyond the current survey zone. What has been excavated is perhaps 5% of what exists. From the very beginning of the excavations, Göbekli Tepe raised questions that the existing frameworks of archaeology were not equipped to answer. The most fundamental, how? How did people who had no agriculture, no settled villages, no draft animals, no wheeled transport, no metal tools, how did they quarry, shape, transport, and erect 20-ton limestone pillars? How did they coordinate the labor required? A single enclosure represents thousands of person-hours of work. The full site, if the geophysical surveys are right, represents an effort comparable to the building of a small pyramid. How was this organized? How were the workers fed? Where did they live? The orthodox answer had always been that this level of coordinated labor required agriculture, required surplus food production, stored grain, the ability to feed a non-farming workforce over an extended period. But the dating of Göbekli Tepe places it before agriculture. Which means either the orthodox answer was wrong, or the dating was wrong. The dating has been confirmed, multiple times, by multiple independent methods. The orthodox answer was wrong. The second great question, why? What was Göbekli Tepe for? The enclosures are clearly not houses. There are no hearths, no storage facilities, none of the debris of daily domestic life. They are not villages. They are not cemeteries in any conventional sense, though there are indications that human remains may have been processed here in ways connected to ritual or belief. They are, by all indications, places of gathering, places where people came together, probably from a wide area, for purposes connected to religion, to ritual, to the maintenance of shared identity and belief. A temple, in the broadest sense of the word. The earliest temple ever found. But the people who came here had no permanent homes nearby. No villages in the immediate area have been found that date to the same period. The builders of the most complex religious site in the world, as far as we can tell, were living in temporary camps, sleeping in the open or in light shelters, moving through the landscape with the seasons. The world was not supposed to work this way. Klaus Schmidt spent 20 years at Göbekli Tepe, and in that time he developed a hypothesis that has become one of the most discussed and debated ideas in the archaeology of human origins. The traditional model of civilization, as I said, goes, agriculture first, then everything else. Farming created surplus. Surplus created settled communities. Settled communities created specialists, people who could spend their time on religion, on administration, on building, on art, rather than on finding food. Specialists created complexity. Complexity created civilization. Schmidt proposed to reverse the arrow of causality. Not farming first, then temples. Temples first, then farming. His argument went like this: Göbekli Tepe required gathering. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people had to come to this place, repeatedly, over generations. They had to be fed. The landscape around the site, in the pre-pottery Neolithic, was rich in wild grasses, wild game, wild almonds, and pistachios. But feeding large gatherings of people, reliably, required more than foraging. It required management. It required the deliberate cultivation of plants, the deliberate tending of animal herds. In other words, the demands of the temple may have created the conditions for agriculture. The sacred site may have driven the food revolution that changed the world. This hypothesis is unprovable. In the strict sense, we cannot run the experiment again. But it is supported by a remarkable geographical fact: the area around Göbekli Tepe, within a radius of a few hundred kilometers, contains the wild ancestors of almost all the founder crops of the Neolithic Revolution. Wild einkorn wheat, wild emmer wheat, wild barley, wild lentils, peas, chickpeas. The domestication of these plants, the transformation from wild to cultivated, which changed everything, happened here, in this region, at roughly this time. Whether Göbekli Tepe caused agriculture, or whether agriculture and Göbekli Tepe were both symptoms of a broader transformation in human society and cognition that was happening at this moment, we cannot say with certainty. But the coincidence is extraordinary. The hill is still mostly unexcavated. Under the dry grass and the limestone rubble of the Harran Plain, the rings of pillars wait, sealed in their fill, patient in their darkness, as they have been for 11,000 years. The 5% that has been uncovered has already rewritten the human story. The 95% that remains is one of the most extraordinary quantities of unknown knowledge on the surface of the earth. In Part 2, we'll go inside the enclosures. We'll look at the carved animals, the abstract symbols, the headless figures. We'll ask what the people who built this place believed, what they were trying to say in stone, in a time before writing, in a language we are only beginning to learn to read. Rest now. Let the hill settle in your mind. In the dark beneath the soil, the pillars stand. They have been standing for a very long time. Part 2, Inside the Enclosures. Come inside. We are standing at the threshold of Enclosure D, the largest and oldest of the excavated enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, built approximately 11,600 years ago. The walls rise on either side, constructed from rough limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. The floor beneath our feet is smooth, bedrock, leveled by human hands, worn further by the feet of people who gathered here across generations. And ahead of us, at the center of the space, the two great pillars stand. They are facing each other across about 8 meters of empty floor. Each one is more than 5 meters tall, taller than a double-decker bus, taller than the ceiling of most modern rooms. Their T-shaped tops are level with the tops of the surrounding walls. In the original structure, there may have been a roof, some kind of covering over the central space, though this has not been confirmed, and the question of whether these enclosures were open to the sky or roofed is still debated. The light, if there is any, comes from above. In the early morning, the sun would have struck the eastern pillar first, then tracked across the floor to reach the western one. The pillars cast shadows. The enclosure breathes with the light and the dark. Stand still. Look at the central pillars. And notice, after a moment, what they are. The two great central pillars of Enclosure D are not simply standing stones. They are beings. The T-shape, which reads at first as an abstract geometric form, resolves, the longer you look at it, into a figure, a being with a wide, flat head, or perhaps a headdress, or a crown, and shoulders. The shaft of the pillar is a torso. And on the torso of each central pillar, carved in low relief but unmistakable once you see them, are arms. Human arms, or the arms of something that was represented as human-like. They run along the sides of the shaft, bending forward at the elbow, with hands meeting at the front of the pillar. The hands are rendered in detail, fingers visible, thumbs distinguishable. And around the waist of each pillar, a carved belt, with a foxpelt loincloth hanging from it. These are dressed figures. They have clothing, or at least, they have a belt and a loincloth, the minimal human covering. They have arms and hands. They have, in the broad flat capital of the T, something that represents a head, even if the facial features have not been carved. What are they? No one can say with certainty. They are too old, too far removed from any written tradition that might give us their names or their stories. But the most widely held interpretation is that they represent supernatural beings, gods, or ancestral spirits, or some category of powerful non-human entity that the people of this time and place believed in and venerated. The enclosures were built around them, for them, oriented toward them. The smaller pillars in the walls may represent lesser beings of the same kind, or human participants in the ritual, arranged around the central presences in a spatial hierarchy that mirrors a social or cosmic hierarchy. The space is organized around encounter, around the experience of standing in the presence of these figures, being seen by them, participating in whatever rite or gathering brought people to this place. But the central figures are only part of what the enclosures contain. The pillars, the central ones most elaborately, but also the wall pillars, are covered with carved animals. And the variety and quantity of the animal imagery is one of the most striking things about Göbekli Tepe. This is not a place with one symbolic animal, one totem species, one dominant image. It is a bestiary, a gathering of creatures from across the landscape and the imagination. Foxes appear more than any other animal, bounding, lunging, turning, their sharp faces carved with an attention to character that goes beyond simple representation. Boars with their heavy shoulders and raised bristles. Snakes coiling along the shafts of pillars, their heads lifted, their eyes depicted as hollows or circles. Cranes in flight, their long necks extended, their wings spread. Vultures, large, heavy-bodied, with a distinctive bald head and hunched posture, in scenes that have attracted particular attention from researchers. There are aurochs, the wild cattle of the ancient world, now extinct, enormous animals that required courage to hunt. Gazelles. Ibexes with sweeping curved horns. Lions, or leopards, positioned in ways that suggest power and threat. A duck. A spider. A scorpion with its tail curved over its back. What may be a mosquito? And stranger things, a creature that might be a predatory bird carrying a human head in its claws. Figures that seem to combine human and animal elements. Abstract shapes, crescents, H symbols, repeated geometric patterns, whose meaning remains unclear. The animals are not arranged randomly. They cluster. Certain species appear together repeatedly, in combinations that suggest intentional groupings, perhaps representing seasons, perhaps directions, perhaps mythological narratives. Snakes and foxes appear together. Vultures and headless humans appear together. The repetition suggests meaning, a symbolic vocabulary that was legible to the people who commissioned and used these spaces, even if it is largely opaque to us. Of all the carved images at Göbekli Tepe, one has attracted more attention than any other. On the broad flat-top surface of one of the wall pillars in enclosure D, the surface that would have been visible from above, looking down, there is a carved scene. A large vulture with spread wings, facing right, with a round object balanced on the tip of its wing. The round object has been interpreted, by many researchers, as a human head. Below the vulture, a smaller creature, possibly a scorpion, and to the side, more abstract symbols including what may be a crescent. Nearby, on another pillar, a headless human figure, carved in a distinctly different style from the animal reliefs, schematic and simple, stands or falls, surrounded by other creatures. These images have generated more interpretation and controversy than perhaps any other aspect of Göbekli Tepe. The most widely discussed reading connects them to a practice that has been documented in the archaeological record of this region, excarnation, or the deliberate exposure of the dead to birds and the elements as a means of processing the body after death. In this reading, the vulture represents a psychopomp, a guide of souls, and the round object on its wing is the skull of the deceased, being carried from the world of the living to whatever realm lies beyond. This interpretation has the support of some physical evidence. Among the bones found at Göbekli Tepe are fragments of human skulls that show signs of deliberate modification, cut marks, polishing, the removal of parts of the bone in ways that suggest they were prepared as objects rather than simply buried. Several carved skulls have been found, what researchers have called skull cults, the keeping and veneration of human remains as a connection to the ancestors. What happened at Göbekli Tepe was not only about the living gathering to worship. It was, at least in part, about the dead, about the relationship between the living and the ancestors, about the passage from one state to another, about the cosmic order that the central pillar figures represented and guaranteed. One of the most remarkable facts about Göbekli Tepe is how the enclosures ended. They were not abandoned. They were not destroyed. They were buried. At some point, and this happened repeatedly, to multiple enclosures, over a period of perhaps 1,000 years, each enclosure was deliberately filled in. Not with random rubbish, not with the accumulated detritus of abandonment, but with clean fill, broken flint tools, animal bones, fragments of limestone, layers of soil, all carefully packed into the enclosure space until the great pillars were completely covered. New enclosures were then built over or near the old ones, sometimes incorporating the buried enclosures into their foundations. The fill is, in its own way, as deliberate and intentional as the construction it covers. This was not the slow burial of a site by the passing of time. This was a decision made by specific people, at a specific moment, for reasons we can only guess at. The enclosures were put to sleep. The reasons for this deliberate burial are completely unknown. There are theories. Perhaps the enclosures were filled when a ritual cycle was completed, when whatever purpose they served had been fulfilled. Perhaps each enclosure was a generation's monument, meant to be sealed when the generation that built it had passed. Perhaps the burying was a form of offering, the most valuable gift possible given back to the earth that had provided the stone. What is clear is that the burial was not a rejection. The enclosures were not smashed or burned. The pillar figures were not defaced. They were simply covered, preserved, protected, put away. As if someone wanted to make sure that what they had built would last. It has lasted. 11,000 years in the dark, and the carvings on the pillars are still crisp. The arms of the central figures are still reaching forward. The fox is still bounding across the stone. In the fill that was used to bury the enclosures, and in the deposits on the floors and in the walls, archaeologists have found bones. Enormous quantities of bones. Most are animal bones, and the species represented give us a detailed picture of what was being hunted and, presumably, eaten at this site. Gazelles are the most common, tens of thousands of gazelle bones, representing hundreds of individual animals. Aurochs. Wild boar. Deer. Birds, including cranes and ducks and vultures. A remarkable diversity of wild species, all of them hunted, not farmed. This is the food record of the gatherings. People came to Göbekli Tepe from across the region, and they ate. Feasting, large-scale communal consumption of food, seems to have been central to whatever happened here. Large stone vessels have been found at the site, including one that could hold more than 150 liters of liquid. Whether this was water, or broth, or some kind of fermented drink, beer, perhaps, made from wild grains, is not known. But the scale of the vessel suggests communal consumption at a scale that goes far beyond ordinary daily eating. This is another of the paradoxes of Göbekli Tepe, the evidence of large-scale feasting at a site with no evidence of local agriculture. The food had to come from somewhere. The logistics of feeding a gathering of hundreds of people in this landscape required planning, coordination, and resource management that we had previously assumed only agricultural societies could achieve. Among the animal bones, there are also human bones. Fragments, mostly, pieces of skull, occasional other elements. They appear in the fill, scattered, not in formal burials. Some show signs of processing, the cut marks and polishing that suggest the bones were handled as objects rather than simply buried. The treatment of the human dead at Göbekli Tepe was different from the treatment of the animal dead, but both were being incorporated into the sacred space, into the fill that covered and preserved the monuments. The site was alive with the dead. The bones of the eaten animals, the processed remains of the ancestors, the carvings of the creatures that moved through the world above ground, all gathered here, in this hill, in this place that stood at the center of something we cannot fully name. I want to sit for a moment with what it means to look at these carvings and these spaces across the distance of 11,000 years. We do not have their language. We do not have their myths. We do not have their names for the pillar figures, or for the enclosures, or for the ritual that was performed here. We have the stones and the bones and the tools, and we have the images carved into the stone, and we have the shape of the spaces, the orientations, the proportions, the arrangement of large and small, central and peripheral. From these, we can say some things with confidence. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not simple. Their minds were as complex as ours, more than capable of abstract thought, of symbolic representation, of long-term planning and coordination, of the kind of cosmological imagination that builds a monument to stand for generations. They had beliefs about the world, about animals and humans, about the living and the dead, about forces or beings that were larger and more powerful than ordinary life. And they translated those beliefs into stone, at enormous effort, over a very long time. What we cannot recover is the content of those beliefs, the specific stories, the names, the doctrines. The images give us hints: a sky full of dangerous creatures, a cosmos presided over by tall, faceless figures, a relationship between the dead and the living that was managed through careful ritual. But the full picture is gone, buried with the people who kept it alive. This is one of the most poignant things about Göbekli Tepe, the richness of what was there, and the depth of what has been lost. Not the stones survived. What was lost was the meaning. The enclosures hold their carvings in the dark. Foxes running. Snakes coiling. The vulture with its round burden. And at the center of it all, the great T-shaped figures with their carved arms, reaching forward across 11,000 years toward something, someone, who stood in this space and looked back at them. In Part 3, we ask who those people were. We go in search of the builders, their tools, their lives, their place in the transformation of the human world. We follow the threads that connect Göbekli Tepe to the beginning of everything we think of as civilization. Rest here. Let the darkness of the enclosure settle around you. The pillars are still standing, in the dark under the hill. Still standing. Part 3, The Builders. To understand who built Göbekli Tepe, you have to let go of the way we normally think about people who lived 11,000 years ago. We tend to imagine them as simpler than us. Less capable. More concerned with immediate survival, less capable of abstract thought, less connected to each other across distance, less able to organize and plan and build. This is not a deliberate condescension, it is almost automatic, the product of a mental picture in which capability increases steadily over time, with modernity at the top and deep prehistory at the bottom. This picture is wrong. It has always been wrong. But Göbekli Tepe makes it impossible to maintain. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, physiologically identical to us in every relevant respect. Their brains were the same size as ours, organized in the same way, capable of the same range of thought. They had language, not writing, but spoken language, with all the complexity and expressiveness that language enables. They had social relationships, kinship systems, ways of transmitting knowledge across generations. They had been making art for at least 30,000 years before Göbekli Tepe was built. They were not simpler than us. They were differently situated, in a different ecological and social context, but not simpler. What we know about their daily lives, from the material record of this period across the broader region, helps us imagine who they were. The people of the pre-pottery Neolithic, the period to which Göbekli Tepe belongs, were hunter-gatherers, but not the thin subsistence foragers that the phrase sometimes implies. The Fertile Crescent in this period was extraordinarily rich. The wild grasses, the ancestors of wheat and barley, grew in dense stands across the hillsides and valleys. Wild almonds and pistachios and figs were abundant. The game was plentiful, gazelles in enormous herds, aurochs weighing a ton or more, wild boar, deer, onagers, wild donkeys, and smaller creatures beyond counting. Fish in the rivers. Birds in the marshes and the sky. People who knew this landscape could live well in it. Not without effort, hunting and gathering is hard physical work, but with a quality of life, and a diet that recent research suggests was probably superior in many respects to what early farmers experienced. Hunter-gatherers in resource-rich environments typically work fewer hours per day to meet their caloric needs than early farmers, and they eat a wider variety of foods, which tends to produce better nutrition and health outcomes. These were not desperate, hand-to-mouth survivors. They were sophisticated people who understood their environment in extraordinary detail, who had developed over thousands of generations an intimate knowledge of the plants and animals around them, who could read the seasons and the weather and the behavior of herds with a precision that no modern person could match. They moved. This is one of the key differences from later settled peoples. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not live in one place year-round. They followed the seasonal movements of game and the ripening of different food sources, here in spring for the gazelle migration, there in autumn for the nut harvest. Their camps were probably light structures, poles and hides or woven branches, easily made and easily left behind. But they came back to Göbekli Tepe. One of the most important things Göbekli Tepe reveals about its builders is the extent and depth of their social world. The site could not have been built by a single small band. The logistics, quarrying and transporting 20-ton stones, sustaining a construction workforce over months or years, feeding everyone who gathered for whatever rituals the site was built for required a network. Many bands, many kinship groups, coming together for a shared purpose. A shared identity larger than any single group. Archaeologists call this kind of aggregated social identity a tribal network, not in the pejorative or imprecise sense the word sometimes carries, but in the technical sense, a system of relationships connecting people across a larger territory than any single family or band occupies, maintained through shared rituals, shared symbols, shared stories. The kind of network that allows people who don't know each other personally to cooperate, because they share a framework of meaning that makes cooperation possible. Göbekli Tepe, in this reading, was the physical center of such a network. The place where the network was made real, where people from across a wide area came together, confirmed their shared identity through shared ritual, and committed to the shared project of building and maintaining the enclosures. The stone itself was part of the message. Moving a 20-ton block of limestone without wheeled transport or draft animals is not just a technical challenge. It is a demonstration, a proof of collective capacity, a statement that this community can do what smaller and weaker communities cannot. The monument announces, to anyone who sees it, that the people who built it are capable of extraordinary coordinated effort. It is, among other things, a declaration of social power. Building Göbekli Tepe required specialists. The carving on the pillars, the precise, accomplished animal reliefs, the carefully shaped T-profiles, the detailed rendering of arms and hands, is not the work of untrained hands picking up a stone chisel for the first time. It is the product of skill developed over years of practice. Someone taught someone else, who taught someone else, across generations. There was a tradition of stone carving here, a lineage of craftspeople who knew what they were doing and passed that knowledge on. The same is true of the architectural knowledge required to design and build the enclosures. The circles of pillars, the careful orientation of the central figures, the leveled floors and fitted wall stones, these required planning, a conception of the finished structure before it was built, the ability to coordinate multiple workers toward a shared spatial goal. This is not intuitive knowledge. It is accumulated, transmitted knowledge, a tradition of building that preceded Göbekli Tepe and was developed further through its construction. Who were these specialists? We do not know their names or their social roles. But their existence implies something important about the social structure of the communities that built Göbekli Tepe. There were people who spent significant time that could otherwise have been spent hunting or gathering, on the craft of carving and building. Someone else was feeding them while they worked. Some system of support existed for the specialists, allowing them to do work that was not directly productive of food. This is, in miniature, the social structure that we normally associate with civilization. Specialists supported by the surplus production of others. Division of labor. Occupational differentiation. Not in a city, not in a state, but in a hunter-gatherer society, organized around a sacred site, in a landscape without a single domesticated crop. Göbekli Tepe did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern of extraordinary cultural activity in the pre-pottery Neolithic of the Fertile Crescent, a pattern that, once you know to look for it, reveals itself as one of the most transformative periods in human history. Within a few hundred kilometers of Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have found a cluster of other sites from roughly the same period that show similar characteristics: large-scale construction, elaborate ritual architecture, evidence of gathering and feasting, symbolic imagery. Karahan Tepe, about 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, is perhaps the most dramatic. Excavations that began seriously only in 2019 have revealed something in some respects even more startling than Göbekli Tepe, a subterranean chamber carved directly into the bedrock, with pillar-like forms emerging from the rock itself, and at the center, a carved human head, realistic, detailed, with a face staring out from the stone. The site appears to be roughly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, and to belong to the same cultural tradition. Karahan Tepe. Tars Tepeler. Harbet Suvan. Sefer Tepe. A constellation of sites, spread across the limestone hills and plains of southeastern Turkey, all built within a few centuries of each other, all sharing the same general vocabulary of T-shaped pillars, carved animals, and ritual enclosures. This was not a local phenomenon. It was not the idiosyncratic creation of one unusual community. It was a regional pattern, a cultural flourishing across a broad area, in which multiple communities were doing something similar, probably in contact with each other, probably sharing craftspeople and ideas and symbolic conventions. Something was happening here. Something large. The world was changing, and the people in this part of the world were, it seems, at the center of that change. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, is the most consequential transformation in human history after the evolution of language. It changed everything: population size, social structure, diet, disease, the relationship between humans and the natural world, the pace of technological change. The world we live in today is, in every essential respect, a product of that transformation. For a long time, we thought we understood how it happened. The climate warmed. Wild grasses became more abundant. People noticed that the seeds of these grasses could be planted and harvested. Over many generations, through a process of unconscious selection, wild grasses became domesticated crops. Farming spread. Everything else followed. This story is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. It treats the Neolithic Revolution as a primarily economic and ecological process, a response to environmental change, driven by the practical problem of feeding people. What Göbekli Tepe suggests is that there was another dimension, a spiritual, social, symbolic dimension that may have been just as important as the economic one. The domestication of plants happened in the region around Göbekli Tepe, within a few hundred kilometers of the site, during roughly the same period that the site was in use. The wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils, and other founder crops grew here. The people who visited Göbekli Tepe knew these plants intimately, had been harvesting them for thousands of years. The step from harvesting to cultivating, from gathering wild grain to planting and tending it, is smaller than it might seem. What if that step was taken not because people were hungry, not because the climate forced their hand, but because a site like Göbekli Tepe required it? A large gathering place, requiring regular, predictable food supplies, creates exactly the incentive needed to begin managing the food supply deliberately. Growing grain near a sacred site, to ensure that the community gatherings could continue, this is a plausible origin story for agriculture, and it is a story that puts the sacred before the practical, the spiritual before the economic. Göbekli Tepe was in use for an extraordinarily long time. The oldest layers, the deepest, the ones that contain the largest and most elaborately decorated pillars, date to approximately 11,600 years ago. The youngest layers date to roughly 8,000 years ago. That is a span of more than 3,000 years, longer than the entirety of recorded Western history from ancient Greece to the present. During that 3,000 years, the site changed. The later enclosures are different from the earlier ones, smaller, less elaborately carved, built with less precision. The T-shaped pillars are still there, but they are smaller and cruder. The animals are still carved, but with less skill and detail. The great central pillar figures of Enclosure D, with their carved arms and belts and loincloths, have no equivalent in the later layers. This decline in elaborateness is one of the puzzles of Göbekli Tepe. It runs counter to the usual expectation that things improve over time, that later work should be better than earlier work, as skills and knowledge accumulate. At Göbekli Tepe, the earliest work is the most impressive. What happened? One possibility is that the social conditions that produced the great enclosures had changed. By the time the later layers were being built, agriculture was becoming established in the region. People were beginning to settle, to live in one place year-round, rather than moving seasonally. The gatherings that Göbekli Tepe required, the coming together of many mobile bands, may have been disrupted by the shift to settled life. The networks that had sustained the site were fraying. The tradition of the great T-shaped figures was fading, not because people had forgotten it, but because the social world that had given it meaning was transforming into something different. The site was finally buried, completely and definitively, around 8,000 years ago. By then, the world had changed beyond recognition. Farming villages were established across the region. The hunter-gatherer way of life was retreating. Whatever Göbekli Tepe had been for, whatever need it had served, whatever meaning it had carried, that need was being met in other ways, or was no longer being felt. The hill was sealed. The pillars went into the dark. The builders are gone. Their names are gone. Their language is gone. Their stories are gone. What remains is the work of their hands, the shaped stone, the carved animals, the careful geometry of the enclosures, and the bones of the animals they ate, and the fragments of their dead, processed and incorporated into the fill that preserved the monuments. In Part 4, we follow the meaning outward. We ask what Göbekli Tepe has changed in our understanding of human origins, of religion, of civilization itself. And we sit with the question the site most insistently poses, not who built it, or how, but why it matters to us now, 11,000 years later, that it was built at all. Rest here. The hill is patient. 3,000 years of gatherings. Then silence. Then the dark. Part 4, what it changes. We have arrived, as we always do in these long evenings, at the place where the specific opens into the general, where the particular thing we have been studying becomes a lens for something larger. Göbekli Tepe is a specific site. Specific stones, specific carvings, specific bones in specific soil layers, in a specific hill in southeastern Turkey. But its implications reach far beyond its specificity. It reaches into the deepest questions we can ask about ourselves, about what we are, about how we became what we are, about what the long human past means for the present and the future. In this final part, I want to follow those implications. I want to tell you about the ongoing research, the new sites, the new technologies, the new interpretations that are still emerging. I want to talk about what Göbekli Tepe has changed in how scholars think about the origin of religion, civilization, and the human mind. And I want to sit with the question it raises most urgently for me: what does it mean that the most ancient monument we have found is a temple? Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, and the excavation of Göbekli Tepe continued under new leadership, initially under the German Archaeological Institute, and then increasingly in partnership with Turkish universities and the Turkish Ministry of Culture. The pace of work has accelerated. New geophysical surveys have refined the picture of what lies beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill. New excavation areas have been opened. New finds have been made. Most dramatically, the years since Schmidt's death have seen the excavation of Karahan Tepe begin in earnest, with results that have startled even researchers who thought they knew what to expect after 2 decades of Göbekli Tepe. The subterranean chamber at Karahan Tepe, with its carved human head staring from the rock, represents something different from Göbekli Tepe, more intimate, perhaps, more directly focused on the human figure, and yet clearly connected to the same broader tradition. The Tars Tepeler project, a coordinated research effort covering 12 sites in southeastern Turkey that are broadly contemporary and culturally connected, has made it clear that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated wonder but part of a cultural landscape of remarkable richness. Site after site has yielded T-shaped pillars, carved animals, evidence of large-scale feasting. The region, in the pre-pottery Neolithic, was one of the most culturally dynamic places on the surface of the Earth. New dating methods have refined the chronology. New analyses of the animal bones have deepened our understanding of the feasting practices. New imaging technologies have revealed details of the carvings that were invisible to the naked eye. The process of understanding is accelerating, even as the site continues to reveal how much remains unknown. And the unexcavated portions of Göbekli Tepe itself remain. The geophysical surveys suggest at least 16 unexcavated enclosures. Some of them may be older than anything yet found. Some may be more elaborately decorated. Some may contain finds that change the picture again, that add another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary story. The hill is still mostly asleep. We have only seen the beginning of what it contains. Göbekli Tepe has forced a fundamental rethinking of the origins of religion, or more precisely, of the origins of formal, organized, architecturally expressed religious practice. Before Göbekli Tepe, the conventional wisdom held that religion, in the sense of shared rituals performed in dedicated sacred spaces, was a product of settled life and agricultural surplus. You needed a society stable and prosperous enough to support a priestly class, to maintain a sacred site, to develop and transmit a body of doctrine. All of that required the economic foundation of agriculture. Göbekli Tepe shows that this is not true. The most elaborate sacred site we have ever found was built before agriculture by people who had no settled life, no surplus in the agricultural sense, no priestly class in any institutional sense. They built it anyway. They came back to it, generation after generation, for 3,000 years. Whatever drove them, whatever need the site served, whatever meaning the carvings and the pillar figures carried, it was powerful enough to sustain that commitment across a longer period than the entirety of recorded history. This changes how we think about religion in human life. If organized, architecturally expressed religion precedes agriculture and settlement, if it is, in some sense, prior to the material conditions we thought necessary to support it, then religion is not a luxury that complex societies develop when they have enough surplus to afford it. It is something more fundamental. Something that human beings were doing, were compelled to do, before they had villages, before they had pottery, before they had the wheel. What does that mean? It could mean that religion, or the cluster of cognitive and social capacities that underlie religion, including symbolic thought, shared myth, ritual coordination, and the attribution of agency to non-human entities, is not a late development in human evolution. It is ancient. It is part of what we are. The religious impulse, whatever its ultimate nature, is not something that civilization produced. It may be something that produced civilization. Alongside the question of religion, Göbekli Tepe raises the question of complexity, of when and why human societies become capable of large-scale coordinated effort. The traditional answer, as I have said, was agriculture and settlement. You need surplus food, stored and managed, to free some people from food production and allow them to specialize. You need settled communities to develop the institutions, chieftainships, priesthoods, administrative systems, that coordinate large-scale projects. You need all of that before you can build anything like Göbekli Tepe. But Göbekli Tepe was built without any of it. No agriculture. No settlement. No stored surplus in the agricultural sense. No evidence of any formal political hierarchy, no palace, no administrative center, no weapons that might indicate a warrior class or a coercive authority structure. What it had instead was shared belief. Shared symbols. Shared ritual. The coordination at Göbekli Tepe was achieved not through political authority but through cultural authority, through a shared framework of meaning that made large-scale cooperation possible without coercion. This is a significant insight for how we think about the origins of social complexity. We tend to assume that complex coordination requires hierarchy, requires someone at the top with the power to direct others. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that complex coordination can be achieved through shared culture, through shared commitment to a project that everyone recognizes as important. The pillar builders did not need a king to tell them to come to this hill. They came because the hill was sacred, because the gatherings were meaningful, because the project of building and maintaining the enclosures was something their world required of them. This is, in some ways, the most radical implication of Göbekli Tepe. Not just that religion preceded agriculture, but that culture preceded politics, that the capacity for large-scale social coordination emerged first in the domain of shared meaning, and only later became institutionalized in the form of formal authority structures. There is a deeper question underneath all of this, and it is the one that I find most compelling. What does Göbekli Tepe tell us about the human mind? We know, from other evidence, that Homo sapiens has been cognitively modern, capable of abstract thought, symbolic representation, language, art, for at least 300,000 years, and possibly longer. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, which date to 30 to 17,000 years ago, demonstrate a capacity for sophisticated visual art that is fully modern in every respect. The abstract engravings found at Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating to 70,000 years ago, suggest symbolic thought even earlier. But the gap between individual cognitive capacity, the ability of a single mind to think symbolically, and the collective cognitive achievement of Göbekli Tepe is enormous. Göbekli Tepe required not just individual minds, but minds working together over long periods of time, coordinating through shared symbols and shared beliefs, transmitting knowledge across generations, building something whose purpose was not immediate survival but the maintenance of a shared world of meaning. That is a different order of achievement. And Göbekli Tepe represents the earliest example we have found of this collective cognitive achievement at this scale. What changed, around 11,000 years ago, to make this possible. The climate change at the end of the Ice Age certainly played a role. The warming landscape was more productive, which may have allowed larger gatherings. Population growth may have created pressures that required new forms of social organization. The gradual accumulation of symbolic traditions over tens of thousands of years may have reached a threshold at which something new became possible. But there is something else worth considering. The capacity that Göbekli Tepe represents, the capacity to build and maintain a shared world of meaning, a cosmos, a set of stories and symbols and rituals that connect individual lives to something larger and longer lasting than any individual life, is not just a historical achievement. It is what human beings do. It is what we have always done, and what we cannot stop doing, because it is part of what we are. We are meaning-making animals. We are cosmos-building animals. We are, in the deepest sense, temple-building animals. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest evidence we have of this. But it was not the beginning of the impulse. The impulse is much older. What Göbekli Tepe shows us is the first moment we can see, the first time the impulse produced something large enough, and durable enough, to survive 11,000 years and still be speaking to us. I want to say something about what it feels like to encounter Göbekli Tepe, not just as an intellectual puzzle, but as a human experience. There are photographs. You can look at the pillars, the carved animals, the careful circles of stone. And the first response, almost universal among people who encounter the site for the first time, is something between wonder and vertigo. The mind reaches for a framework and finds that the usual frameworks don't apply. These are not primitive people doing primitive things. These are people of extraordinary capability and depth, doing something we recognize, making sacred space, gathering together to affirm shared belief, building something to outlast themselves, in a time so remote that our usual sense of historical scale collapses. The fox is still running across the stone. The vulture is still carrying its round burden. The great T-shaped figures are still reaching forward with their carved hands. And the people who made these things, who stood in these enclosures and performed whatever rites they performed, who feasted on the hillside and looked up at the stars above the plain and felt the presence of whatever presences they felt here, those people are our ancestors, in every meaningful sense of the word. Not ancestors of a particular ethnic group or nation, but ancestors of the human project, of the long, unbroken effort to make sense of the world and our place in it. We are continuous with them. The distance is real. 11,000 years is not nothing, but it is not the distance between primitive and modern, between simple and complex. It is the distance between us now and us then, in different circumstances, doing what we have always done. Göbekli Tepe leaves us, ultimately, with a new story about ourselves. Not a story in which civilization arrived late, as a product of economic necessity, after a long period of simple animal existence. But a story in which the capacity for civilization, for shared meaning, for collective action in the service of something larger than immediate survival, for the building of a world held in common, was there from the beginning, or close to it. Was there before agriculture, before settlement, before writing, before any of the things we usually point to when we try to explain how we became what we are. The temple was first. Or at least, the temple was very early, earlier than anything else we have found that bears comparison to it. Before the grain was planted, before the first village was built, before the first city rose from the plain, someone stood on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey and decided that this place was sacred, and that something permanent should be built here, and that the effort required, the enormous, extraordinary, generation-spanning effort, was worth making. That decision is not so different from decisions that human beings have been making ever since. To build a cathedral. To write a poem that no one may read. To plant a tree in whose shade you will never sit. To do something whose value is not in the immediate return, but in what it says about who we are and what we believe the world is for. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest instance we have found of that impulse. But it was not the first. It will not be the last. The hill is there tonight, on the limestone ridge above the Harran Plain. The excavated enclosures are covered, not by their ancient fill, but by a modern protective roof, to keep the carvings from the rain and the sun. The unexcavated portions are under the grass and the soil, as they have been for 11,000 years. The pillars stand in their circles in the dark, the carved animals frozen in their perpetual motion, the great central figures reaching forward with their stone hands into the space that was once filled with firelight and the smell of roasting gazelle and the voices of people who traveled far to be here. Above the hill, the stars have not changed. The same stars the builders watched, Orion, the Pleiades, the band of the Milky Way that blazes above these plains far from any modern light, still track their paths across the sky. The Saros cycle still predicts the eclipses. The Milky Way still arcs from horizon to horizon on clear nights. Someone looked at those stars from this hill, 11,000 years ago, and felt what we feel when we look at them, the scale of things. The smallness of a human life. The desire for something to hold on to, something larger, something that lasts. They built this. It lasted. We found it. We are still finding it year by year, as the excavations continue and the geophysical surveys map what lies beneath, and new sites emerge from the limestone hills of southeastern Turkey to tell us, again and again, that the world is older and richer and more human than we knew. The carvers of Göbekli Tepe are gone. But the fox is still running. The vulture is still watching. The great figures are still standing in their enclosures in the dark, their carved hands reaching forward across the millennia toward whoever is standing in front of them. You are standing in front of them now. That is what the long walk through the past is for. Not to leave the present behind, but to arrive at it with different eyes, to see the stars above the plain, and the hands reaching forward from the stone, and understand, finally and simply, that the impulse that built Göbekli Tepe and the impulse that brought you here tonight to listen are the same impulse. We are still the temple-building animal. We are still gathering in the dark to share what we believe the world means. Good night. The pillars are standing. In the dark, under the hill, on the ridge above the plain, the pillars are standing. They have always been standing.